I'm Chris McLaughlin. I'm the General Manager at North Simcoe Community Futures Development Corporation, one of the partners bringing you the Ask the Expert series. The Planning Committee at Ask the Expert series is led by the County of Simcoe and Joanna Griggs and now Hannah Conroy. So thanks to their leadership, we're able to bring organizations throughout the county some excellent content as you navigate the current environment. I'd encourage you keep an eye out for our future webinars. In addition to the county, there are a number of regional partners who have assisted with these webinars. The Small Business Center of Barrie, Simcoe County and Orillia, South Georgian Bay Small Business Center, Orillia Area CDC, Nottawasaga Community Futures, the Center for Business and Economic Development, and North Simcoe Community Futures Development Corporation. Just a few housekeeping items. Prior to today, some of you had provided questions in advance, and these questions were provided to our guest expert today, Rob Stelzer, and he has tried to incorporate some of those into his presentation. There will be some time after Rob's presentation to take some additional questions. So if you do have a question that pops into your mind during the presentation, please place them in the chat area, and you'll find the chat button at the bottom of your screen, and you'll be able to provide your question there, and we'll try to get to as many as those at the end of Rob's presentation. So it's my pleasure to be introducing today our expert on financial distress and knowing your options. Rob Stelzer is the Vice President Advisory Services in the Grant Thornton Recovery and Reorganization Group. Rob provides restructuring, financial advisory, and financial modeling services to organizations in a wide range of sectors, including retail, manufacturing, distribution, technology, and automotive. Over the past 12 years, Rob has assisted companies with turnarounds, companies' corporate recovery, and business vitality reviews. Rob has acted as a consultant and financial advisor for debtors, as well as financial advisor for creditors in several high-profile Canadian restructurings and insolvency proceedings. In addition, Rob has managed distressed entities representing both the debtor and the creditor sides, using legislative and informal restructuring processes, including receiverships, bankruptcies, and proposals. At the request of the Ontario Securities Commission, Rob was appointed as trustee in a high-profile bankruptcy and in another mandate as a receiver to distribute proceeds to harmed investors. Rob has extensive expertise in financial modeling and has been engaged by both solvent and insolvent companies to forecast their future cash flows, often in support of a request for financing, as part of a turnaround, or in support of mediation. After graduating in the top 10% of his class at the Smith School of Business at Queen's University, Rob earned his CPA and CA designation before working at an internet startup listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange and London AIM. We are happy to have Rob with us today to provide insights regarding insolvency, restructuring, corporate recovery, and business viability. So thanks again, and help me welcome Rob Stelzer.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Chris, for the introduction, and thanks everyone for your time. As Chris mentioned, I'm a licensed insolvency trustee with Grant Thornton. And so I thought we would take about 30 minutes today and just walk through some high-level topics related to insolvency and restructuring. Given the current environment, I thought it made sense to start with a macroeconomic overview and talk a little bit about COVID-19 and its impact. That is not my area of expertise, but nevertheless, I think it does set the stage just with a bit of background about the current environment. Then we'll get into my area of expertise, which is restructurings and insolvency. As Chris mentioned, I assist companies that are struggling regain financial health and effect a turnaround. So we'll talk a little bit about restructurings and also about bankruptcies as well. And then lastly, I thought it made sense to talk a little bit about communications with lenders and other stakeholders, which is a very, very important part of any successful turnaround plan. So that's our overview. So without further ado, I will dive into the first topic, which is the macroeconomic environment. So this is a chart just showing the COVID-19 cases, and I thought it made sense to start with this because obviously the current situation that we're in, the current economic climate is of course one very much shadowed by the COVID-19 pandemic, and of course. Earlier in the year, April, May, there was a real spike in cases. We've been very fortunate in Canada to have a real improvement of that situation over the summer months. But cases, as you can see, have been on the rise a little bit in the month of September. Now, part of that, of course, could be increased testing that's being done, which of course spots additional cases. But it also, of course, as you all know, could lead to a second wave, and that, of course, would lead to much of the challenges we saw earlier on in the year, intensifying. So I think that's obviously an important consideration for any business, but particularly ones that are heavily impacted by COVID-19. Canada, of course, has fared relatively well. We have less than 140,000 cases as of yesterday. This compares with 6.7 million cases in the United States. So, even if you were to adjust, our population is the U.S. is about 9 times greater than ours. But even if you adjust for that, there's a pretty sizable disparity between the number of cases that we've had and the number of cases they've had south of the border. Of course, the pandemic has not impacted the economy equally. It's not, the decrease in GDP, which economists are forecasting could be in the 6 to 8% range. It's not been uniform at all across the sectors. Even if you look at like a particular sector, like let's say retail apparel, there's been some big winners and losers. Like here in downtown Toronto, if you operate like a high-end menswear shop with all these empty office towers, et cetera, of course, huge impact on financial performance and of course on revenues. Whereas if you sell more casual clothing, like Lululemon, they've actually seen an increase in sales. So key sectors that have been impacted, of course, are travel, a number of different retail sectors. Some cases like travel, it really is because of the pandemic. The sector was not by and large in trouble before the pandemic, and others like retail were already facing a number of different challenges. Amazon has been a real challenge. E-commerce in general, but Amazon in particular has been a challenge for a number of retailers. And that, of course, is just accelerated because of the pandemic. And then the other factor, just to be mindful of is there's a number of government programs which are at the moment propping up the economy, things such as the CEWS, the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, which is provided to employers, or the CERB, which employees can receive. And of course, these programs are set to expire. Even if they are extended, if there is another shutdown, they of course will not be extended indefinitely. So there is going to have to be a reckoning, and that is going to put a lot of pressure, unfortunately, on households and small business and the economy at large. The other thing that I'd add about COVID-19 is that so far, the large, Schedule I banks in Canada, like Royal and CIBC and TD and others, they've been quite patient with companies that are facing financial distress, but that will not continue forever. So of course, it's our expectation that there will be an increase in enforcement proceedings by the banks. So that, of course, will put more pressure on different sectors of the economy. in terms of the overall impact of this thing, certainly if you compare it to the last recession we had in 2009, this is quite a bit deeper. It may feel to some folks like it's less of an impact because, of course, of the government subsidies, and we certainly haven't had the the collapses in the equities markets that took place earlier in the year. Pretty much recovered both in Canada and the United States, but the overall economy is arguably quite a bit weaker, and total GDP is expected to be quite a bit lower as well. So I thought just that high level background might be of some assistance just in delving into the topic of insolvencies. I thought we would broach the subject by breaking it down into a couple different categories, and you really can think of financial distress on a continuum. You've got on the one side of the ledger businesses that are they're fundamentally great businesses, and revenue is down. Maybe they've even tripped a covenant with their lender, but at the end of the day, the business is still fundamentally a sound business, and it's just weathering a difficult time, and will in some cases may need a covenant waiver, for instance, from its lender. And then, of course, at the other end of the spectrum, you've got full out receiverships and bankruptcies, and the business being liquidated and not continuing. So we're going to just sort of walk through the different types of situations, insolvency related situations. The first thing I thought I'd start off with was informal options. So these are situations when there is, for instance, a covenant breach, or there is a need to seek some sort of accommodation from key stakeholders, be they banks, landlords, suppliers, maybe even customers in accelerating payment terms. You see that sometimes happen in automotive and other sectors where the end customers are quite a bit larger, and sometimes they have a vested interest in their supplier staying in business. Sometimes informal restructurings can take place via a forbearance agreement, where basically the company acknowledges the default with its lender, and the lender agrees not to exercise certain remedies that it has pursuant to its credit agreement with the company. So informal options can be very attractive for a number of reasons. First of all, they tend to be much less expensive. So if the company is fundamentally sound, but there's just a challenge with the lender, informal type of arrangement would make a lot of sense in that type of situation. Because they're less costly, that obviously is just very attractive. And if you've only got one key stakeholder like the bank, they really are the best way to go. There are, though, certain legislative options available to companies. So these are only available to companies that are insolvent. So there's different definitions of insolvency, but typically it means that a company that's unable to pay its debts as they're due. And insolvency options, legislative ones, can really be seen in sort of two categories. You've got creditor-driven insolvency remedies. So these are enforcement proceedings. So if the bank, pursuant to its security agreement, appoints a receiver over the business, or if the creditors petition a company into bankruptcy, a trustee in bankruptcy would take over and would operate the business and in some cases, but ultimately liquidate the assets and distribute what's available to the creditors. And then you've got debtor-driven insolvencies. These are instances where it's not a receiver or trustee in charge, but rather the company maintains control of its assets. So the company avails itself of certain protections pursuant to the legislation, like the Bankruptcy Insolvency Act or the Companies Creditor Arrangement Act. And those makes a filing under those options, and then gets some protection from the legislation, which we'll talk about. And I figured it made sense to focus more on these Bankruptcy Insolvency Act proposals than anything else, in this presentation, because I think it is always helpful, if your business is facing some financial distress, or maybe if it isn't, thankfully, today, but it might in the future, depending upon the graphs we were looking at earlier about COVID-19 and how things progress and what the economic recovery looks like. It's always good, of course, to understand what options are available. So there's two pieces of legislations that deal with these debtor-driven restructurings. I'm not going to focus on the Companies Creditors Arrangement Act. That's a piece of legislation that really exists for large restructurings. So, just by way of example, it's a number of years ago, but I think it's an example that everyone knows. You probably know that in the early 2000s, Air Canada filed for bankruptcy protection under the Companies Creditors Arrangement Act. So in that situation, Air Canada did not stop operating. They still continue to provide services to their customers, but they were protected by the legislation from anyone taking enforcement proceeding, and they tabled a proposal to their creditors. And that proposal was voted on and ultimately was approved, and that allowed Air Canada to substantially reduce its debt burden and therefore be able to stay in business. So what I am going to focus on, though, is the Bankruptcy Insolvency Act proposals. They really are very similar to the Companies Creditors Arrangement Act proceeding that Air Canada and many others have filed under, but they're just right-sized for small businesses, small to medium-sized businesses. So I thought maybe I'd just take a couple minutes and walk through how a Bankruptcy Insolvency Act proposal works. So, in the event that a business determines that it is insolvent and needs the protection of the legislation, the process is typically started by the filing of something called a Notice of Intent, or NOI for short. And that basically provides an automatic 30-day stay of proceedings that prevents creditors from proceeding with enforcement proceedings. The NOI is signed by a representative of the company. Typically, that's the president of the company or a member of the board, and it is authorized by a resolution of the board. And the basic idea is to provide the company with 30 days. That 30-day period, by the way, can be extended through court extensions for a total of up to 6 months, basically to allow the company to put together a plan, for its creditors. And then that plan, of course, is voted on by the creditors. If a BIA proposal is filed by a company, it also has to file a cash flow statement within 10 days of the filing of the NOI. Why are BIA or Bankruptcy Insolvency Act proposals useful? Well, there's a couple reasons. So one, of course, you get this immediate stay of proceedings. So if there is a creditor that is, attempting to garnish the bank account or initiate or advance a lawsuit, all of that is stayed, so that party cannot proceed with that action. It also can be helpful for disclaiming contracts. So if, for instance, the business really has a couple contracts that are preventing it from being profitable, the BIA provides the ability of a company to disclaim those contracts. So a classic example of that would be a lease. So if let's say it's a retail operation, it's got 3 stores, 2 of them are profitable and 1 is just a complete dog, and it is dragging down the entire business. A BIA proposal would allow the company to disclaim the lease with that one very unprofitable store. So that, of course, can be very helpful to a business that just cannot pay its rent costs, for instance. But it can apply to other contracts as well, not just leases. A BIA proposal can also provide for certain court-ordered charges. So, for instance, to get priority financing. So this is financing ahead of even whatever the current secured lenders of the business. So sometimes when a company files, it just needs a little bit of money to cover payroll and other costs in order to keep operating. Again, filing a proposal and getting that court-ordered charge, is very helpful from a liquidity perspective for a business. At the end of the day, though, the company, in order to exit the proposal proceedings, has to table a proposal to its creditors, and ultimately, you can think of the proposal as a contract between the creditors and the company. And in the proposal, in the contract, the company spells out what its plan is. So, as a simple example, if it's a good business that is, making, positive margins, positive returns, but just has too much debt that it can't possibly service, the proposal could be very simple. We are going to pay all of our creditors 50 cents on the dollar of what they are owed. And of course, the creditors have to accept that. If the creditors do not vote in favor of the proposal, there's an automatic bankruptcy. So obviously the company wants to work hard to put together a proposal that is acceptable to its creditors. But if the company is able to do that and the creditors accept the proposal, then that contract, that proposal, in effect becomes the new deal. So if the creditor pool was $1,000 before the filing, and everyone agrees to accept 50 cents on the dollar, then once the company pays out its $500 to its creditors, it has met the terms of its proposal. And the approval by the creditors of the proposal is really a two-pronged test. First of all, you need to have the majority in number of the creditors accept the proposal. And second of all, you need to have the majority in number and 2/3 in value of the creditors need to accept the proposal. And that basically is to the 2/3 test, is there to make sure that the majority of creditors, or more than the majority, I should say, accept it. And the numbers test basically prevents, a proposal that is perhaps favorable to a really large creditor. Let's say you have one large creditor that's 70% of the pool and a bunch of other smaller creditors. The reason for that majority in number test is just to make the proposal, fair and reasonable for the other parties. Once a proposal is approved by the creditors, then it requires court approval. And the court really is there just to make sure the proposal is, is compliant with the requirements under the Bankruptcy Insolvency Act, and also provide any dissenting parties with a forum to be heard. I did want to touch briefly upon bankruptcy. So bankruptcy, of course, tends to be a situation where a business does not continue. Sometimes there can be a bankruptcy and then a sale of assets and the business can continue. But normally, of course, a bankruptcy is not a situation where, unlike a proposal where typically the business does, survive and continue, a bankruptcy usually, culminates in a liquidation. Bankruptcies can be initiated by the creditors through petitioning a company into bankruptcy, but often they can be initiated by the business itself. And that is accomplished by filing what's called an assignment in bankruptcy. And that makes sense for a business to do when it determines that it has no intention to keep operating. We've seen a few examples in retail lately where that's the case. The business just determines, unfortunately, we're woefully insolvent and don't think we're going to be solvent anytime soon. So it makes sense to wind up the operations. In that case, unlike a proposal where the company keeps operating, the licensed insolvency trustee, so that would be someone such as myself, would be appointed, and that person would be responsible for selling the assets and distributing whatever's available to the creditors. And the role of the trustee is multifaceted, but a big part of the role is to maximize recovery for creditors. So that's by no means an exhaustive list, but I hope that gave you a little bit of an overview of insolvency, both the informal arrangements that can be that can be entered into with creditors or lenders, and the formal options, both the debtor-driven proposals that may be applicable if anyone in the audience has a business that unfortunately is going through a tough time. That's something we can certainly chat about. If a proposal would make sense, or even a bankruptcy in a case that there had to be liquidation, and then if we've also touched a little bit about enforcement proceedings like a receivership or a bankruptcy requested by the creditors. So I know that was a lot of ground to cover, but hopefully that just helps you understand a little bit of the options available for businesses that are in experiencing financial difficulty. I thought we would spend the remainder of the formal remarks, because of course, as Chris mentioned, we'll open this up to questions, just talking about communication with stakeholders. So, one of the things that I've noted in my practice is I've seen a number of companies start insolvency proceedings, for instance, the BIA proposal or the CCAA that we were talking about earlier, and do things really well, and get their creditors on side, do it with minimal legal intervention, not a lot of use of the court, and really get back on their feet and be very nimble, successful, and do quite well. And I've seen other companies that were much less successful. In some cases, a proposal that just unfortunately was not accepted by the creditors, or the terms of the proposal were just not terms that company could meet. And if I could pick a single variable that is most responsible for why some businesses were successful whereas others were not, it would be communication with stakeholders. So I thought I would just assemble on these slides just a couple points, a couple key themes that I've seen that separate the successful restructurings from those that have not been successful. And the first thing that I've noticed for the successful restructurings is that the companies that are facing the financial distress tend to be more proactive. So often they will approach their lender before their lender approaches them about their financial difficulties. Sometimes they'll get some concessions from the landlord or from the lender or other stakeholders. Generally, as part of that proactivity, they've been prepared to share information with their stakeholders. In some cases, even unionized shops have been, quite transparent with the union and successful in extracting concessions from the union because, they've shared, they've left them in the tent and see, how bad things are. I think another part of being proactive, and one that anyone who's has an ownership stake in a business that is experiencing some distress, is understanding the impact on you personally. So certainly, I've had times when I've met with clients and they're not aware that they've personally guaranteed the loan to the the bank, for instance. So certainly, doing all of those things and being proactive, understanding, because the negotiation with a lender, if you have, if they have a personal guarantee and you have a fair amount of personal assets, it's a different conversation than if there is no personal guarantee for the lender, and if the lender's recovery without your assistance would likely be quite poor. So it's just important to understand all that up front. Another thing that has separated the successful restructurings from the less successful ones is having a financial model. Something that allows the business to A, understand what your cash is today, but B, understand what your projected cash is going to be. Understand what your projected covenants are going to be. So if there's certain covenants that are important to the lender, and you've got a model that can forecast those covenants, that will really, really help. And ultimately, when you come up with a plan, it really, it's best to start with your cash flow and your financial model first. You don't want to offer, for example, 50% to all your creditors. Discuss that with them, have them vote on it, only to find out that you could never pay more than 40% based on your financial model. So obviously the sophistication of these models varies tremendously based on the complexity of the business and of the situation. Sometimes they can be, very high level Excel schedule. Other cases, I've had clients where, we've spent literally weeks putting together the financial model because it's a very, very large, complicated company, and there's a lot of moving pieces, and it may be asset sales that we have to, put in the model and show where that capital is going to go, et cetera. But having some sort of financial model really is something that is, important for success. Another thing that is important, and it kind of ties in, I suppose, with the first point about proactivity, is really communicating with everyone, with the employees, with the suppliers, with the customers. Obviously, you want to be able to, first, ideally in secret, put together a bit of a plan. So you don't want to communicate with someone without having something worthwhile to say in terms of what your plans are. But you also, it can be very damaging. I've seen situations where companies have been quite secretive, they haven't communicated, and then there's been a leak. And really, instead of them controlling the messaging about what their restructuring plan is and what they want to do, they're playing catch up. And there's a newspaper article or something else that shares the information first, and sometimes not in a completely accurate or favorable way for the company. So communication is key. Showing the lender, for instance, how they're going to get repaid on their loan, anticipating the questions that creditors have in advance. All of this is very helpful. And then, the last thing that I'd say is, and this sort of ties in a little bit with the financial model, but don't just do the financial model, but monitor against your financial model to understand your cash. Because obviously, if things do go off the rails, let's say your revenue projections aren't as strong as you think they're going to be, the sooner you can understand that and reforecast, if needed, the better shape you're going to be in terms of understanding how you can spend your cash, and if you need to request further concessions from your creditors. So I know that was a lot of information to throw at everyone. I hope it was helpful, but we've taken, I guess we're about 35 minutes or so into the presentation, and really this is meant to be your forum to ask any questions you may have. So I think it makes sense now just to open the floor up for questions. There were a few questions that were shared with me prior to this presentation, but I thought it might make sense first, if anyone on the line just has any questions whatsoever about financial distress or restructurings, please raise your hand and ask them.
Rob, I'm not sure if I'm back on live or not, but
you are.
I am. Okay. So there is a question that has come in. It looks like, when is a good time to look at restructuring? And then secondly, how can startup businesses use the information that you're providing now, maybe to develop a plan for worst case scenario? If the plan doesn't work, then what do I do? And at what time should I be saying, ooh, I need to be looking at this?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think, regarding the first question about when is a good time, I mean, I think it's about being proactive. It's hard to manage a business. And I have a lot of sympathy for that. As Chris, you mentioned in the opening remarks, I did spend some time at a startup, an internet startup. It was not ultimately successful, but it really did leave me with a real appreciation for how difficult it is to make a successful business. So when is the right time? It's when things are sliding and going downhill. But don't wait too long. I remember early on in my career, our corporate finance practice was approached by a gentleman that wanted to sell his business, and there were a couple unfavorable trends, and he really wanted 20 million for his business. And the corporate finance practice was able to get 16 million, and he said, "Forget it. I want north of 20." But he was an older gentleman. The market was, facing a couple challenges that he was in, and bottom line, he let things go way too late. He ended up instead meeting with me and one of my colleagues, and filing. And ultimately, he was placed into receivership by his lender. The lender liquidated the business for less than their loan, and their loan was like $5 million. So it was just, to me, a classic example of just waiting too long. So look, I think most business owners have a pretty good appreciation for their business, and know in their heart of hearts how things are going. And if you have a bad month or two, fine. But if you're starting to have more than a bad quarter, I think it is important to have an honest look at your options, because what we see so often in my business is it's a bit like going to the doctor. Nobody really wants to take time out of their day and deal with discussing things that are unpleasant, which is your business is struggling. But if you wait too long, if you wait till it's 3 days before your payroll is due and you can't make payroll, it's going to be a very difficult conversation, because for instance, there's director liability for unpaid wages and vacation pay in Ontario. So then what do you do? Do you stiff the bank that has a personal guarantee? Do you not pay your workers, who then are not going to show up, which means your business is potentially done, and then take on the employee liability as well? So one of the things that people in my line of work often complain about is that businesses just show up too late. So if you're wondering if it's time to have a chat, it probably is. It's better to do so earlier, even if you just to understand your options, than waiting until you're really on dire straits, because you just don't have a lot of options. If you have 2 months of cash left in the bank, you've got a little bit of time to maybe file a proposal, take a bit of a war chest. You've got a little bit of flexibility. But if you've got 2 weeks left of cash burn, that's just a lot less room to maneuver. And then the second question you asked was about startups. And of course, none of us start businesses with the intention of them failing, and that, of course, should not be anyone's focus. But I think it is important early on just to understand what your appetite for risk is. So for a lot of lenders, for instance, they'll ask for a personal guarantee, and you'll be able to get more money if you're willing. If you have assets like a home, or car, or whatever else. But of course, if things go belly up, then they're going to be looking to those assets to satisfy themselves if there's a shortfall on the corporate loan. So I think just maybe in addition to doing a business plan, having a bit of a, if things go badly, how will this work? I think mapping that out a bit is helpful for any business. And frankly, let's just sleep a little better at night, just sort of knowing, how protected you are. So I hope that addresses those two questions.
I think it does, Rob. I was wondering if there was maybe a clear marker within, say, a profit and loss statement that a business could look to. Maybe you had mentioned 1 or 2 months of poor poor standing? Are you talking about net profit? Are you talking about gross profit? Or is there, maybe a number or maybe two numbers in a profit statement that, that someone can look to?
It really depends on the business. Unfortunately, there isn't like a particular ratio or number I can point to, but um, I think what's more helpful than historical financials is projected financials, and that kind of goes back to the cash flow statements that we were talking about earlier. So like let's say that you're I don't know, a menswear retailer, and your sales are down 40% over last year. If this continues for the next 6 months, are you going to be okay? So I think I think that's probably more. Um, are you going to be okay from a cash perspective, and are you going to be okay from a covenant point of view? Because of course, you know, um, understanding what the covenants are that the bank is monitoring, and how they're gonna change over time is really important. So I've had instances where I've helped a business with a cash flow. We've met with the bank, and we've said to the bank, things are bad and they're going to get even worse, but we think you should support us, and here's why. We're going to have maybe we're going to have less cash, but we're going to have more inventory. It's a seasonal business. That inventory, here are the orders that we have, et cetera, et cetera. The more you can put together the case, if in fact it is your belief that things are going to improve, the better situation you're going to be in. So yeah, I mean, it really is a case by case diagnosis, much like if a person is diagnosed with you know a, cancer or heart disease or anything like that. Like it's always case by case in terms of what the prognosis is, and it's the same in a business. No two businesses are identical, and um, so and there's different lending agreements and default provisions and stuff like that. But I think if you can forecast your future projections, that's as good a guide as any.
Excellent. That's great. Thanks for adding that to your comments there. And I think one of the pieces that you mentioned earlier was a personal guarantee. And there's two questions that are related to that in the chat room right now. One being, and I think you alluded to it, would be that if my corporation, the question is if my first one is if my corporation becomes insolvent, will I lose my home? And then the second one is if I'm a sole proprietor and my business becomes insolvent. So they're not exactly the same, but maybe you could provide some insight into the impacts of insolvency with a director of a corporation and insolvency on a sole proprietor.
Sure. So in the case of a corporation, a guarantee is just that. It's there to satisfy the indebtedness to the lender only in the event that the company is not able to satisfy that indebtedness. So the bank will not come and sell your house right away or something like that. It will first make demand to the party that signed the agreement. Typically that would be the corporation. An agreement, a credit agreement between the corporation and the lender. So I've had a number of instances where business owners have been later in their careers, and they want out, and the business. I had one that was a book distributor. The gentleman was, I think he was 62. He was planning on retiring at 65, but lost a major customer, and so his focus was really on just maximizing recoveries, and so I've had instances where you've gone to the lender and say, look, the business is facing these headwinds. We want to wind down the business, and we're going to work with you to maximize those recoveries so that my indebtedness to you is as low as possible. So that's typically the first line of defense. Um, you know, Homes can be a little bit uh, a little bit tricky, particularly if if there's another person that occupies the home. So, for instance, a spouse that occupies the home, and that's probably a more complicated subject for another day. But yes, I mean, in essence, if the lender is not able to satisfy itself, let's say that there's a $300,000 loan, that the business liquidates its assets and is able to generate $200,000, such that there's a $100,000 shortfall. Yeah, I mean, the bank's remedy would be to sue and get judgment, and you know, uh, attempt to have those assets sold in order to satisfy the amount owing to the bank. But of course, if it's a matrimonial asset, it's a little less straightforward. The question about a sole proprietor, obviously in a sole proprietor, there isn't a separate corporate entity. So, it really, there's no need for a guarantee, because, it's you who is both borrowing for the business, and you who is, on the hook for the assets of the business. So again, there really isn't a lot of difference in um, a financial distress situation between having a corporate entity and guaranteeing it, and being a sole proprietor. But in either case, there's an obligation of the individual to pay the bank. Now, banks will typically be it's not inexpensive for them to pursue a person personally. It's usually worth having a lawyer look at the agreement. Sometimes there's, imperfections in the agreement that might make it harder to enforce. Often they will negotiate with the party. But nevertheless, if you did sign a personal guarantee, there's no doubt that there is personal risk for you in the event that the business cannot repay what's owing to the bank.
That's great. I think that answers those particular questions. So just looking back at some of the questions that were provided ahead of time, I'm just looking through them to see which ones you might be able to tackle. Maybe, and I think they might be back to your answer of doing some financial modeling and doing some cash flows and seeing where things go. But one of them is getting out of debts when the minimum payment is larger than the income you have coming in. And the other being advice for next steps in a second wave of COVID. Any suggestions from you on how to maybe tackle those?
Yeah, so in the first situation, this is something that happens to businesses all the time, which is the business just has too much debt. Really, that's what happened to Air Canada. Like if you boil it down to its simplest roots, they just had too many liabilities. But there's a fundamentally good business, overall that exists. So if that's true for your business, if the business is it's generating a positive gross margin, it just can't cover the debt service. That's a particularly good situation for a proposal. Maybe it starts with an informal restructuring. If there's only like one or two parties, maybe you can do the whole thing on a handshake. But informal restructurings require unanimous consent. So if all but one of your major creditors accepts it, that's a problem, because if the one party that won't accept it, if they insist on getting paid $100 right away, that can frustrate an informal restructuring. And that's part of the reason why these proposals are so helpful, because they really use the will of the majority to speak for everyone through that voting process I mentioned earlier. So yeah, bottom line, if the company is profitable but for its debt service, then it's particularly helpful if there's no personal guarantee, because then you just say, look, I can't operate this business. I'm generating, for example, $10,000 a month, and my debts are 15. Like the math doesn't work. We've got to reduce those debts to something less than 10,000 a month in order for this business to keep operating, and that's where proposals tend to work quite well. And sorry, remind me the second question that you asked?
Was related to maybe how a business can prepare themselves for a second wave of COVID.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, this is obviously you know, a, a, a tough one because none of us know the trajectory that this is going to take. Um, you know, and I'm sure everyone on this call that has a business, is already doing these things. But now is not a good time for most businesses to expand, or take on new space or anything like that. I mean, I think it's just being exercising some austerity and trying to save up some cash. Um, like, because obviously, you might need it if your business is unable to operate for some period of time. Like, let's say that that the province is talking about further restrictions, and if those impact, let's say you've got a restaurant. Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing you can do is just try to really manage your costs um, and be careful. And I know that's easier said than done, but that's probably all that one can do at this point in time, given that we just don't know what's going to happen.
And another question from that was provided ahead of time was, what is the economic recovery forecast for event businesses where their revenues have fallen to zero? I don't know whether maybe you'd be privy to some, not necessarily inside information, but some modeling with respect to the impact on event-based businesses and what their potential recovery could look like.
Yeah, no, that definitely event-based businesses, like trade shows, or like anyone affiliated with weddings or any of that type of stuff. I mean, it's been very, very impactful because, of course, of the restrictions on the size of gatherings, and even notwithstanding the restrictions imposed by the province, there's a lack of desire from consumers, right, to just to go out more than they have to. Um, I mean, I know that the forecast, I think Stats Canada is forecasting an 8% reduction in GDP this year, which is obviously huge. The chart I showed you earlier showed a 6% reduction, but of course, in the event space, it's a lot more than that for just about anybody in the event space. In some cases, revenues have basically gone down to zero. Now, of course, there are a number of programs that the government has put in place to help businesses. Things like um, the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, the CEWS that I mentioned earlier. That's really a tax thing. Like, I'm certainly, if someone has detailed questions about those programs, I'm happy to put them in touch with someone in our tax group who can speak much more intelligently about that than I can. But I think it's, my own personal view, I think it's going to be a long time until we have large events that. Would not seem to be something that's going to happen this year, and probably not for the first half of next year. So it is a difficult situation. I will say that I've seen some really entrepreneurial businesses. So just as an aside, we had a marketing event put on with a law firm we do some work with, and it was put on by a sommelier whose business has been very much impacted, and so she's moved to a virtual model. So she showed up at everybody's house with 3 bottles of wine, and then we got on Zoom and we had a marketing event. And I thought it was really creative, in a great way for, I'm sure she's not making as much money as she used to with her physical events that were much larger and more frequent. But, she said she's doing all right, and it seems to be a good way to adapt to these difficult times.
Thanks very much, Rob. I'm not seeing any additional questions in the chat. And I think that for the most part, we covered off the questions that were submitted in advance. And if your question that you provided wasn't answered today, it could be that it's not necessarily Rob's area of expertise, but we will take these into consideration and try to connect you with someone that would be able to support your needs and see how we can help you through this time. I want to thank I want to thank Rob for your insights today. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us today. I want to thank everyone for participating online. There will be a survey that will be sent to you by email asking you to let us know what you thought of today's presentation, any suggestions on future presentations. And I'd also like you to know that there will be a recording of this session that will be available to you after. And that will be included in the email with respect to the survey. And if you're interested in hearing from any other experts in our series, you can look to simcoe.ca/askanexpert. And I just want to again thank you, Rob, for your time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Hannah, for putting this together, and Carol and Wendy in the background helping us facilitate this. And thank you very much to the County of Simcoe and all of the partners involved today. And we wish all of you a fantastic rest of the day and the week. And I hope that you all take care and stay safe.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everyone.